In the early 1940s, before the Allies had turned the tide of the Second World War, the British Army faced a crisis of steel and strategy. The lessons of Dunkirk were still fresh in every military planner's mind. Across the Channel, the German Wehrmacht had stormed through Europe with a terrifying combination of speed, coordination, and mechanized precision. Their panzer divisions cut through Allied defenses like a blade through paper. Britain, for all its resilience and courage, had to admit an uncomfortable truth. Its tanks were no match for Germany's armored might. In those grim days, British tank design lagged far behind. The early models, such as the Matilda II and the Crusader, had shown moments of promise, but also glaring weaknesses. The Matilda was a lumbering fortress, its heavy armor admired, but its sluggish pace a fatal flaw in modern mobile warfare. The Crusader, on the other hand, was fast but fragile, its thin plating and unreliable mechanics making it a liability on the battlefield. Tank crews fought bravely, but no amount of courage could compensate for inferior machines. Inside Britain's War Office, the mood was tense. Engineers and strategists understood that the next generation of tanks would determine not only the outcome of battles, but the survival of the British Army itself. If they were to face the German Panzer IV, or, worse, the newly emerging Tiger I, Britain needed a tank that could do what its predecessors could not. It needed something fast, reliable, and versatile, a tank that could outmaneuver the enemy even if it could not outgun them. That desperate need gave birth to the Cromwell. Developed under the codename A27M, the Cromwell was unlike anything Britain had produced before. Its creators at Leyland Motors and Rolls-Royce took inspiration from aircraft engineering. They stripped away excess weight, streamlined its frame, and fitted it with a powerful Meteor engine, a direct descendant of the legendary Merlin engine that powered the Spitfire fighter plane. For the first time, a British tank would move not with the slow clatter of iron, but with the deep, confident roar of aviation power. The Cromwell could reach speeds of over 40 miles per hour on roads, an astonishing figure for a tank in 1943. Crews quickly learned that its acceleration and handling could outclass anything they had driven before. While the Tiger I loomed large as a heavily armed beast, the Cromwell represented something far more subtle, the embodiment of mobility as survival. Yet, even as excitement grew around the new tank, skepticism lingered. Many officers doubted that speed could compensate for firepower. The Cromwell's 75mm gun, though a step forward from older British calibers, was still no match for the thick armor of German heavy tanks. To some, the design seemed like a compromise, a tank that was neither strong enough to slug it out nor stealthy enough to avoid battle. But to others, including the men who would eventually drive it into Normandy, the Cromwell was a revelation. By 1943, the Allies were preparing for the most ambitious military operation in history, the invasion of occupied France. Britain knew that tanks would be crucial to the success of D-Day and the liberation of Europe. American factories were sending over hundreds of M for Shermans, reliable and mass-producible machines that would form the backbone of the Allied armored force. But Britain wanted a tank of its own, a symbol of national engineering, determination, and pride. The Cromwell was chosen to fill that role. At testing grounds across England, tank crews trained relentlessly. They learned to exploit every advantage the Cromwell offered. They practiced rapid flanking maneuvers, coordinated movements with infantry, and even simulated ambushes in the rolling countryside. The Cromwell was a driver's tank, responsive, agile, and fast. In mock battles, it darted through obstacles and outmaneuvered older designs, showing that agility could indeed be a weapon. What set the Cromwell apart was not only its engine, but its spirit. The crews who manned it were often young, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to their machine. They saw themselves as pioneers of a new doctrine of armored warfare, one that valued movement, deception, and speed over brute strength. In the pubs and barracks, they joked that the Cromwell might not win a duel against a tiger, but it could dance circles around one. The British military establishment slowly began to understand that wars were not won solely by having the biggest gun or the thickest armor. They were won by adaptability, the ability to fight on your own terms. The Cromwell represented that shift in thinking. It was not designed to go toe-to-toe with German tanks in open fields. It was built to move fast, to exploit terrain, and to support infantry in rapid assaults. By the time 1944 arrived, the Cromwell was ready for war. It had been tested, modified, and refined through endless trials. Britain had produced more than 4,000 of them, each one a testament to the nation's industrial resilience. Engineers had worked tirelessly to correct early issues with suspension and gearboxes. Crews had developed new tactics that emphasized coordination and communication. Still, uncertainty loomed. The Normandy invasion would be the Cromwell's baptism by fire. Would its speed truly make a difference against the German panzers that had dominated Europe for years? Or would it fall victim to the same fate as its predecessors, outgunned and outmatched? As the Allied Armada gathered along the English coast in June 1944, thousands of soldiers waited for the signal to cross the Channel. Among them were the men of the British 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats. These veterans of North Africa had fought against Rommel's Afrika Korps and had seen firsthand the importance of mobility in armored warfare. Now they would take their experience, their courage, and their Cromwells into the hedgerows of Normandy. For Britain, the Cromwell was more than just a tank. It was a symbol of redemption, proof that innovation could rise from desperation. It was the mechanical expression of a nation that refused to be defeated, that adapted to survive, and that believed speed and ingenuity could overcome even the mightiest of foes. As the invasion fleet set sail toward France, the Cromwell's engines rumbled with anticipation. Its crews knew what awaited them: the thick Bocage country, the deadly ambushes, and the relentless might of the German armor. But they also knew something the enemy did not yet realize: that sometimes the fastest way to win is not to fight harder, but to move smarter. The Cromwell was about to prove it on the battlefields of Normandy. In June 1944, the world witnessed the beginning of the greatest military operation in modern history, Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The beaches of Normandy were a chaotic inferno of courage and fear, where every soldier, tank, and plane played a part in the desperate gamble to liberate Europe. Among the forces preparing to land was the British 7th Armored Division, the legendary Desert Rats. They had fought the German Afrika Korps across the sands of North Africa, and now they were about to face their old enemies again, but in a very different kind of battlefield. This time, their weapon was the Cromwell tank. The Cromwell rolled into France in early June, not on the beaches of D-Day itself, but soon after, as reinforcements began to push inland. The men who drove these machines knew they were not invincible. They had studied reports of German Tigers and Panthers, tanks whose armor could shrug off British shells like pebbles. Yet, the Cromwell's crews carried something the Germans could not easily counter: speed and tactical ingenuity. The Normandy landscape was unlike anything they had fought in before. The Bocage, thick hedgerows that bordered every field, turned the countryside into a deadly maze. Visibility was limited. Every bend, every small lane, every sunken road could conceal a German ambush. The Cromwell's narrow profile and exceptional mobility quickly proved to be life-saving advantages. In terrain that seemed built for defense, the Cromwell became a machine for surprise. British commanders quickly learned how to adapt. Rather than engaging German tanks head-on, Cromwell crews used the terrain to their advantage. They flanked enemy positions through narrow gaps in the hedgerows, maneuvered swiftly across open ground, and called in artillery fire to finish what their 75mm guns could not. The Cromwell's top speed on open roads was unmatched by any other Allied tank. Even in the muddy fields of Normandy, its Meteor engine gave it a burst of acceleration that could mean the difference between life and death. Tank Commander Sergeant Bill Cotton of the 7th Armored Division later recalled how the Cromwell's agility often saved his crew. "We never went looking for a tiger, but if one came looking for us, we made sure it never caught us twice." The Cromwell could be halfway across the next field before a German could swing his gun around. The Cromwell was not perfect. Its armor, though improved over previous models, was still vulnerable to German high-velocity rounds. Many crews learned the hard way that the first shot in a tank battle often decided everything. But while the German tanks relied on heavy armor to survive, the British relied on movement, hit fast, reposition, and strike again. This philosophy became known among the tankers as shoot and scoot. By mid-June, the Cromwells of the 7th Armored Division were fighting their way through the tangled roads west of Cong. Their mission was to outflank German defenses and open the way for the Allied breakout. The Germans responded with ferocity. Panzer divisions, including the elite 12th SS Hitlerjugend and the Panzerlehr Division, threw everything they had into holding the line. The Cromwells found themselves in running battles where ambushes, artillery, and air support all played decisive roles. The men inside the tanks lived under constant pressure. The interior of a Cromwell during combat was a world of heat, smoke, and deafening noise. The roar of the Meteor engine mixed with the clatter of tracks and the concussive blasts of enemy fire. Communication depended on shouted orders and hand signals. For every mile gained, the price was steep. Yet, what emerged from these brutal days was a new confidence in the Cromwell and in the doctrine of mobility it represented. In one engagement near the village of Tilly-sur-Seulles, a squadron of Cromwells managed to outflank a group of German Panthers that had pinned down a British infantry company. Using the narrow lanes and hedgerows as cover, they maneuvered into a firing position that caught the German tanks by surprise. The Cromwell's guns opened fire, not aiming to destroy but to distract. As German turrets turned to face the threat, British artillery zeroed in. Within minutes, the Panthers were burning wrecks. It was not brute strength that won that fight, it was timing, coordination, and the Cromwell's agility. These encounters began to reveal a pattern that British commanders embraced. The Cromwell's value lay not in winning duels, but in shaping the battlefield. Its speed allowed it to scout, flank, and exploit gaps in enemy lines. Its crews became masters of improvisation, working with infantry and artillery in fluid coordination that mirrored the German blitzkrieg tactics of earlier years. In many ways, Britain was now beating the Germans at their own game. Still, the challenges were immense. German anti-tank guns, particularly the feared 88mm, could destroy a Cromwell with a single hit. To survive, British crews had to rely on every ounce of training and instinct. They learned to move unpredictably, to use terrain as armor, and to never stay in one place for long. For some, survival depended on split-second decisions, whether to advance, reverse, or risk a dash across open ground. For the infantrymen following the tanks, the Cromwell became a reassuring presence. It was fast enough to respond quickly when pinned down and agile enough to provide fire support in the most difficult terrain. Soldiers often describe the sight of a Cromwell bursting through a hedgerow as both terrifying and magnificent, a machine built for speed suddenly appearing like a predator on the hunt. As the British Army advanced deeper into Normandy, reports began to filter back to London. The Cromwell was performing beyond expectations. It had not replaced the heavier Firefly or the versatile Sherman, but it had carved out its own reputation as the tank that moved like lightning. Military analysts began to understand that in the dense, unpredictable terrain of Normandy, speed was not a luxury, it was survival. Every mile gained in those weeks was a testament to the men inside the Cromwells. They were not just fighting machines, they were fighting a doctrine, the belief that mobility could overcome might. Against tigers and panthers, they were often outgunned. But with courage, coordination, and the will to move faster than the enemy could react, they proved that victory could come from ingenuity as much as from firepower. As June turned to July, the battles around Cong reached a fever pitch. The British and Canadians launched repeated offensives to capture the city, facing some of the most fanatical resistance of the war. The Cromwells were there in every assault, pushing through mud, shellfire, and the wreckage of burned-out armor. Every advance brought them closer to the moment when all that training, speed, and endurance would be put to the ultimate test. The test would come at a small Norman town called Villers-Bocage, a name that would become etched in the history of armored warfare. There, the Cromwells would meet their greatest challenge and face one of the most feared tank commanders in the German army. It would be a day of chaos, courage, and the kind of heroism that defines history. In the early morning of June 13, 1944, the quiet town of Villers-Bocage in Normandy was about to become the stage for one of the most dramatic and closely studied armored engagements of the Second World War. The British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, had pushed further than any other Allied unit since D-Day. They had advanced rapidly through the Bocage, seeking to exploit a gap in German defenses and turn the enemy's flank. At the spearhead of this daring advance were the Cromwell tanks of the 4th County of London Yeomanry. The plan was bold, perhaps too bold. British reconnaissance indicated that German resistance in the area was light. The Cromwells rolled forward, their engines growling through the morning mist, unaware that hidden in the fields and lanes ahead lay one of the deadliest tank commanders of the war, SS Hauptsturmführer Whitman and his Tiger I. Whitman, already a legend on the Eastern Front, commanded a machine that had become the symbol of German armored superiority. With its thick armor and powerful 88mm gun, the Tiger I could destroy a Cromwell before the British crew even saw where the shot came from. At around 9 a.m., as the British column entered Villers-Bocage, Whitman's Tiger lay in wait on a small ridge overlooking the road. What happened next would become one of the most famous ambushes in tank warfare. Whitman, acting on instinct, ordered his crew to advance. Within minutes, the German Tiger opened fire and chaos erupted. The first shots tore into the leading Cromwell, igniting its fuel and blocking the road. More shells followed in rapid succession, striking British half-tracks and Sherman Fireflies. The surprise was total. Eyewitnesses described the devastation as instantaneous. Within a few moments, several British tanks and vehicles were ablaze, their crews scrambling for cover. Yet amid the confusion and destruction, something remarkable happened. The Cromwell crews did not surrender to panic. Instead, they began to adapt. Using side streets and narrow lanes, they maneuvered their tanks out of Whitman's direct line of fire. Several Cromwell commanders made split-second decisions to relocate, flank, and return fire. Though their guns could not penetrate the Tiger's armor from the front, they aimed for its weaker sides and rear, attempting to slow or disorient their opponent. In one of the surviving Cromwells, Lieutenant Bill Cotton led a small group of tanks into the center of Villers-Bocage. Using the town's narrow streets for cover, they turned the environment itself into a weapon. The Cromwells darted between buildings, firing from concealment, then retreating before Whitman could bring his massive turret to bear. It was the very doctrine of speed and agility the Cromwell had been built for, a doctrine that, on this day, meant survival. Whitman's Tiger rampaged through the British column, destroying more than a dozen vehicles. But every moment he spent engaging targets gave the remaining Cromwells time to reposition and regroup. When British reinforcements arrived, they quickly set up an ambush of their own. The battle that followed was brutal and confused, with smoke and fire filling the town. Eventually, Whitman's Tiger was forced to withdraw. The British had lost many men and machines, but they had not been broken. Their resilience and ability to adapt under fire turned what could have been a total disaster into a testament of courage and tactical improvisation. After the engagement, surviving Cromwell crews shared stories that would echo across generations of tank soldiers. They spoke not only of fear but of determination, how they learned to trust their machines and each other. They had seen the enemy at his most fearsome, and they had endured. Military historians would later analyze the Battle of Villers-Bocage in extraordinary detail. It became a case study in armored warfare, showing how surprise, terrain, and individual initiative could shape the outcome of combat far more than raw numbers or superior equipment. The Cromwell, though technically outclassed by the Tiger, had proven itself capable of surviving and even countering the most formidable enemy tank through mobility and teamwork. For the 7th Armored Division, Villers-Bocage was both a painful lesson and a defining moment. It revealed the limits of Allied intelligence and planning, but it also demonstrated the adaptability of British tank crews. In the days following the battle, They regrouped, reorganized, and prepared for the next phase of the campaign. The Cromwell, battered but unbroken, continued to serve at the front lines. As word of the battle spread, so did the myth of Whitman's ambush. German propaganda hailed him as a hero, while alive reports emphasized the bravery of the British crews who faced him. Yet, behind the headlines, the real story was more nuanced. The Cromwell had not been designed to fight tigers head-on, but in Villers-Bocage, it had shown that even in the most desperate conditions, courage and quick thinking could turn the tide. The engagement also spurred a re-evaluation of British tactics. Commanders began to emphasize combined arms operations even more, integrating armor, infantry, artillery, and air power in closely coordinated assaults. The Cromwell's speed made it an ideal vehicle for these new maneuvers. It could move rapidly to exploit breakthroughs or withdraw before the enemy could retaliate. The lessons learned in Villers-Bocage would shape the next stage of the Allied advance, the breakout from Normandy. For the men who fought there, Villers-Bocage would never be forgotten. They remembered the choking smoke, the burning metal, and the deafening roar of tank engines. They remembered friends lost and moments of impossible bravery. And they remembered how, even in defeat, they discovered a new confidence in themselves and in their machines. In the weeks that followed, the Cromwell's role evolved from that of a supporting tank to that of a spearhead. It would no longer be confined to cautious advances or defensive operations. Instead, it would lead the charge, breaking through enemy lines with speed and precision, opening the way for the Allied forces to sweep across France. The British Army had learned that the Cromwell's greatest weapon was not its gun, nor its armor, but the skill and daring of the men who commanded it. The tank had become a symbol of British ingenuity, proof that even when outmatched in firepower, intelligence and courage could redefine the battlefield. As July approached, the Allies prepared for a new offensive, one that would shatter the German lines and turn the battle for Normandy decisively in their favor. The operation was codenamed Bluecoat, and once again, the Cromwell would be at the forefront of history. The age of static warfare was ending. The age of speed was about to begin. By late July 1944, the fields of Normandy were no longer defined by defense. The hedgerows that had slowed the Allied advance for nearly 2 months were giving way to open ground, and with that change came a new opportunity, one the British intended to seize. The Cromwell tank, once considered a compromise between speed and strength, was about to prove that mobility was not merely a design choice, but a decisive weapon of war. Operation Bluecoat would mark that turning point. Launched on July 30th, 1944, Operation Bluecoat was a British offensive designed to support the American breakout at Saint-Lay and to draw German reserves away from the southern front. For the first time in the Normandy campaign, the British would fight on terrain that favored speed and maneuver. The open countryside east of Caumont offered the perfect proving ground for the Cromwell. Gone were the claustrophobic hedgerows of the Bocage. In their place stretched rolling fields, villages, and country lanes where the Cromwell's 600-horsepower Meteor engine could unleash its full potential. The 7th Armored Division, still recovering from Villers-Bocage, was again at the spearhead. Alongside them were units from the 11th Armored Division, equipped with both Cromwell's and Sherman Fireflies. Together, they formed the cutting edge of the British advance. The orders were simple: push south, seize the high ground near Mont-Pinçon, and exploit any weakness in the German lines. The Cromwells led the charge. As the assault began, the speed of the British advance caught the Germans by surprise. Used to the slow, grinding pace of previous battles, they were unprepared for the lightning-fast movement of Cromwell columns sweeping across the countryside. The tanks roared down roads and across fields, bypassing strong points and striking at command posts and artillery positions before the defenders could react. For the crews, it was a revelation. After weeks of cautious fighting in the hedgerows, they could finally use their machines as intended. The Cromwell's suspension, designed for high-speed travel, absorbed the shocks of rough ground effortlessly. Crews described the exhilaration of racing through villages at full throttle, the wind tearing at their faces through open hatches, their tanks leaping over craters as the enemy scrambled to respond. One British tank commander, Captain David Render of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars, later recalled, "The Cromwell was a joy to drive when you had room to move. We could go places the heavier tanks could not. When the Germans thought they had us pinned, we were already behind them." German reports confirm how disorienting this new tempo was. Allied armor seemed to appear everywhere at once. The Cromwell's speed made it difficult for German anti-tank crews to establish ambushes, and their rapid advances disrupted communications and logistics. Even when faced with superior German tanks like the Panther, the Cromwells used mobility and terrain to outflank and overwhelm them. Operation Bluecoat also showcased how far British tactics had evolved since the early days of the war. The Cromwell was no longer acting alone. Infantry and artillery moved in close coordination, while air support from RAF Typhoons provided devastating strikes on German armor. The result was a fluid, relentless offensive that forced the Germans into retreat. The Cromwell, once seen as an underdog, had become the symbol of British momentum. By early August, the success of Operation Bluecoat had helped create the conditions for a massive Allied encirclement of German forces near Falaise. As the enemy attempted to withdraw, Cromwell units raced ahead to cut off escape routes, their speed allowing them to cover ground that other tanks could not reach in time. For the first time since the landings, British armor was not reacting to the enemy, it was dictating the pace of battle. Photographs from those days show Cromwell's thundering down dusty roads lined with cheering French civilians. The white Allied star painted on their hulls was a symbol of liberation. To the people of Normandy, the Cromwell was not just a tank. It was the embodiment of freedom arriving at full speed. By mid-August, the German 7th Army was in full retreat. The British and Canadians pressed their advantage, cutting deep into occupied territory. The Cromwells led columns across rivers, through villages, and into open country, pursuing the remnants of the once feared Wehrmacht. It was a reversal of everything that had happened in 1940. For years earlier, British troops had fled across the Channel from Dunkirk. Now, with Cromwell's in the vanguard, they were racing across France, driving the enemy back toward Germany. Though overshadowed in popular memory by the Sherman Firefly and the Churchill, the Cromwell's contribution to this victory was profound. It demonstrated that British engineering could produce a machine capable of standing with the best of the war. Its design philosophy, prioritizing speed, reliability, and maneuverability, would influence future generations of armored vehicles. More importantly, it validated a doctrine of warfare that valued flexibility over brute force. As the British Army advanced toward Belgium and the Netherlands in the following months, Cromwell units continued to serve with distinction. They were among the first to enter liberated towns and among the last to withdraw at night. Their speed allowed them to exploit breakthroughs and respond rapidly to counterattacks. The crews had learned to trust their tanks completely, knowing that the Meteor engine beneath them could carry them through danger when others might be trapped. The Cromwell's legacy was not measured solely in victories or territory gained, but in the transformation it represented. It had begun as a desperate experiment, born from the lessons of failure. In the wake of Dunkirk, British desires had chosen to abandon the obsession with heavy armor and instead embrace agility. That decision, once controversial, had proven visionary. On the battlefields of Normandy, it saved lives, broke enemy lines, and helped turn the tide of the war. In the final months of 1944, as Allied forces prepared to cross into Germany, the Cromwell remained a key part of Britain's armored spearhead. Its final acts of the war were in the liberation of Northern Europe, from the pursuit across France to the advance into the Low Countries and beyond. Wherever speed and adaptability were needed, the Cromwell was there. Looking back, historians have called it the most balanced British tank of the war, fast, reliable, and able to perform in nearly any role. Its story is one of perseverance and adaptation, of engineers and soldiers working together to overcome limitations through creativity and courage. The Cromwell never had the raw power of a Tiger, nor the global fame of a Sherman, but it earned something far more enduring: the respect of those who fought in it and the admiration of those who understood what it achieved. It embodied the British approach to warfare: steady, intelligent, and relentless. When victory finally came in 1945, the Cromwell rolled into Germany as both a conqueror and a survivor. Its engine, born from the same design that powered the Spitfire, had carried it across Europe. Its speed had become a symbol of liberation, its success a tribute to innovation over intimidation. The story of the Cromwell tank is not merely about machines of war. It is about human ingenuity under pressure. It is the story of a nation that learned to adapt, of soldiers who learned to fight smarter, and of how speed, in both thought and movement, helped turn the tide of history. From the ashes of Dunkirk to the fields of Normandy and beyond, the Cromwell proved that victory does not always belong to the strongest armor, but to those who can move the fastest, think the quickest, and dare the most.